So, in the beginning, there was George A. Romero. More or less in the beginning. There were zombie films before George Romero, but the zombies in those were kind of shuffling slaves, voodoo zombies. There's a couple of movies in the sort of 20s and 30s, a few with Bela Lugosi. But zombies didn't really start eating people's faces until Night of the Living Dead, which was made in the 60s by George A. Romero. In the 1970s, George would go on to make his magnum opus, which is Dawn of the Dead, and anybody watching this video should have seen Dawn of the Dead by now, if not Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. And then by the time we got to the 80s, George was knocking out Day of the Dead, and the zombie genre had started to kick off. Return of the Living Dead came out. That had a couple of sequels. Over in Italy, there was a unofficial sequel to Dawn of the Dead, as well as a few other zombie movies dotted around here and there. And then Michael Jackson happened. Michael Jackson killed the zombie movie. Ironically, you can't kill a zombie unless you are the best-selling pop star in basically all of history, because he came out with Thriller, filmed a music video for that, in which he's shuffle dancing around with an entire army of zombies. I know you've seen it. And that basically killed zombies for about 20 years or so. So during sort of my coming of age time in the 90s, there was absolutely nothing. Zombie media didn't exist. It was a dead format. And then we start to get up to the turn of the millennium. And in 2002, Danny Boyle releases 28 Days Later, which was possibly the first film, I think the first film that essentially had running zombies throughout the entire running time of the film. Now, there was running zombies before. Return of the Living Dead, I think, had a couple of zombies that sort of darted here and there, but they were never really the focus. They were mostly shuffling. 28 Days Later completely changed the landscape for zombie media, zombie horror entirely. The threat had been completely ramped up now in order to meet a new generation, essentially. There was a huge argument at the time. Is it a zombie film? Is it not a zombie film? You know, the characters in it get infected with a rage virus, and that's what makes them chase after everyone. It's a zombie film. We can make peace with that now. Back in 2002, we might have argued about it, but we know it's a zombie movie. One of the more unique things about 28 Days Later was that it was basically shot on a handy cam format. Digital cameras had become, quite sort of small and portable and easily available by the time we got to the year 2000. And films such as the Blair Witch Project started to come out to show that, amateur filmmakers now had all of these options available to them. And it was quite an exciting time. Danny Boyle decided to capitalize on that. He took small camcorder equipment and he shot around the London area, which meant he had easy access to things like outside of Parliament and Big Ben, things like that, at 2 o'clock in the morning, or well, maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They could get in, they could shoot, and they can get out without having to do these entire massive setups because they were shooting almost guerrilla style on small handycams. It gave the film a rough and ready look to it. It made it feel real. It made it feel like something that you could have filmed, or I could have filmed, anybody could have filmed. And so it no longer had that sort of Hollywood gloss to it. It looked, rough and ready. The downside to that is it looks like ass. If you try and watch it today on a much larger, 4K TV, for example, that film was shot in a standard definition mini DV format, I think. It was not made to be projected up to 4K. So the fact that there are Blu-rays of 28 Days Later is actually kind of funny. Some of the landscape shots in that, if you try and watch them on a screen now, you genuinely, if you look at the still frames of a landscape in that film, you can't actually make out what a lot of stuff is. There's a shot of a field, I think, in 28 Days Later. You can't make out the flowers or anything because it's so pixelated because of the format. But having said that, it still works. You can still watch it now, and if anything, it still has that rough and ready look, but also it sort of transports you back to 2002. In the wake of that film, the zombie sort of genre exploded. Shaun of the Dead came about, and at the same time, Shaun of the Dead, the remake of Dawn of the Dead, made by Zack Snyder. And in the remake of Dawn of the Dead, the zombies are now running, because 28 days later had upped the threat that, people sort of weren't really believing the slow shuffling zombies anymore. I think Shaun of the Dead got away with it because Shaun of the Dead is, it's technically a parody. It's not a big, obvious, broad parody like The Naked Gun or Airplane or anything like that. But it is a comedy as well as a horror. So I think the horror elements are fantastic in Shaun of the Dead, don't get me wrong. But I think the fact that we also had gags coming thick and fast meant that the audiences could kind of accept the shuffling zombies in that movie. But for the most part, if zombies weren't running anymore, audiences didn't really want to know. George Romero managed to get Land of the Dead out, his fourth zombie film, and his return to the genre. That came out, I think, after both Shaun and the remake of Dawn of the Dead. And so that interest got the sort of grandfather of zombies back on the big screen. And then after that, TV started to take over with things like Dead Set, which is a fantastic show by Charlie Brooker, who's the maker of Black Mirror. And in that show, the zombies again are running around the UK, and the only people that are safe are these sort of 5 or 6 people that are trapped inside the Big Brother house, which is a fantastic piece of satire. Definitely worth tracking down if you haven't seen it. It is just as dark and miserable as Dead Set, but also kind of funny. Walking Dead obviously started to come out and was absolutely massive. Went on for, what's still going on in spin-off form at the minute. So what's that, a decade and change maybe? And then video games suddenly had a brand new faceless enemy that they could abuse. And video games suddenly had Left 4 Dead, Left 4 Dead 2, Dead Island 2, Dying Light 2, Dead Rising 2, 3, and 4, Plants vs. Zombies. Zombies were everywhere. They were in Call of Duty, as was George Romero in the same zombie mode. We went from nothing in the 90s to 28 days later coming out and completely kickstarting an entirely new interest in zombie media that's been around since. Pretty much the entire time between that first 28 days later and this recent 28 years later. Zombies are everywhere. And it was all due to 28 days later reinvigorating that interest. A couple of years after 28 days later came the sequel 28 Weeks. Now, 28 Weeks was made by essentially a completely different cast and crew. It still takes place in England, but it's also Americanized in the film and behind the scenes. In the film of 28 Weeks Later, there is the virus has basically starved itself out. And then American soldiers come over to England to start quarantining and start trying to build the country back up again so that it can open its borders and let refugees back into the country. And then obviously shit goes upside down and all the zombies kick off again and start running around eating people and vomiting blood and all the fun stuff. 28 Weeks tried to replicate the feel of 28 Days. It tried to replicate that kind of in-your-face, shit, we're being chased, run, anxiety and panic-stricken feel of that original movie. It didn't manage it. It started off phenomenally. The opening scene is absolutely fantastic. And the film itself is not a terrible watch. It's a perfectly fine horror film. It's a perfectly average, enjoyable movie. It just doesn't hit the highs that 28 Days Later did and doesn't really do anything spectacularly different to merit itself existing. It does end on a cliffhanger, which I'm going to spoil for you. So if you haven't seen 28 Weeks, I'm going to ruin that. And at the end of that film, the virus is back out again in the UK and has made its way across the border to Paris. So the final shot is the Eiffel Tower and then a bunch of infected running around. It's a bit of a gaudy shot, the Eiffel Tower, but it got the point across in like a single shot, so that's fine. Since then, we've been waiting for 28 months. We've been waiting for the virus to make its way across Europe and potentially across the world. We've been waiting for that film. And it never came. Which now that I've seen both 28 Years Later and the sequel that just came out 28 years later, The Bone Temple, I'm kind of glad we didn't get 28 months because the setup was okay. It could have made a decent enough horror film, zombies running around Europe, great. But so what? What's zombies running around Paris? How's that any different to zombies running around London? They're not talking, so the accent's not any different. I can't imagine there's much in it. So I was excited-ish for a 28 months, but when 28 years was announced, that film looked and acted completely different to everything that had preceded it. Now, 28 years later had some interesting marketing in that the trailer didn't give very much away about the actual plot of the film. It relied a lot on the nostalgia for the original movie and then showed some sort of surreal and new and interesting imagery without giving too much away. The film was made again by Danny Boyle, written by Alex Garland, who wrote that first film. So there was kind of a getting the gang back together mentality to it. But then when you were in the sort of cinema and you went and sat down and watched that film, what you were presented with is a film that's actually vastly different to the first two entries in the franchise. And it sounds odd to say franchise because for the last 20 something years, there's only been two movies. You were presented with a film that was shot on iPhone, which is the sort of equivalent of the first one being shot on Handycam, but is luscious and green and has some gorgeous landscape shots and some really sort of interesting experimental cinematography and night scenes and things like that. It's a beautiful film. The first movie is very grey, very brown, not much color to it. Even when they get to the landscape areas, it's kind of muddy because of the pixelated look of the film. Whereas 28 years, even though there are some scenes where you can see the limitations of the iPhone quality on the footage, it actually just makes it look unique. The plot of that film, again, was not interested in just repeating the shit, 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 run, run, run narrative of the original movie, and instead wanted to be the opening chapter of what has now gone on to be a two-film with a third film coming saga that speaks about the division of Britain, sort of in the face of and after COVID. It also uses the zombies as kind of a mirror to humanity, which is not a new thing to do. George Romero has been doing that literally since his first movie. But in 28 years later, the entire kind of purpose behind that is grief and the acceptance of grief. And the fact that both humans and the infected are heading towards the same ending, ultimately. And this is personified in Ralph Fiennes' character in the film, who is a doctor that builds a bone temple, which is the name of the sequel. That bone temple is essentially the body parts of the deceased that have been cleaned and built into statues and monuments. And it doesn't matter whether the deceased were human or whether they were infected, as far as he was concerned, they're all the same thing. The last act of that film, I think people, not unfairly, were perhaps expecting a big set piece driven, high energy, high octane, zombie action piece. And instead we're presented with three characters talking in a forest, which I think kind of threw some people for a loop a little bit. I thought it was fantastic. I can see how some people may be like, well, where's the 28 days later feel in this 28 years later movie? I get that. But for me, I think why just repeat the same film? You've done it once, you've done it twice, so why not use that universe if you're going to come back to it to build something new? And they did that. They used the zombies as a metaphor for a reflection of humanity, and that we're both the same, and that we're both heading towards the same death. The film has some experimental cinematography in it. There's a fantastic use of a camera rig that has sort of like 8 to 12 iPhones all attached to like a semicircle. And so every time a creature gets an arrow through the chest, it's like kind of a matrix, like a homemade matrix camera pan. And that was really good. It looked really unique. But ultimately, the film was very human, very grounded, very emotional, and a lot slower than the original 28 Days Later. It also gave up some of that feel of hyperrealism to present the beginning of almost like a fable, like a story being told as opposed to a moment being lived in. As I say, the last act is very emotionally based and it's very slow moving, but then the film has a tag on the end, which is kind of a teaser for the next movie. Now, I didn't realize there was going to be a next movie when I first went to see 28 Years, so this tag confused the shit out of me, which is the little boy Spike on his own being attacked by a bunch of infected, and then a group of guys with scraggly blonde hair and tracksuits jump down and help him save him, and start sort of flipping all over the place and cutting zombies' heads off and doing all of this. Um, it's a strange tag, and it doesn't really fit the tone of the rest of the movie. And I was a bit sort of, I don't know, anxious about it being included, because when I found out there was going to be another film and then potentially a third film, the first thing that went through my mind was, well, what if the second film is shit? Which, happens quite a lot. So what if it's terrible? Now you've added a tag onto the end of your 28 Years Later, which is a very good film and a very good standalone movie. You don't even need to have seen 28 Days to see 28 Years. But now you've added a tag onto there that ties into a film that could be awful. And if that film is awful, now you can't really watch 28 Years without this kind of little thing on the end that wouldn't make much sense unless you watch the next film. Luckily for us, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, which came out at the beginning of this year, directed by Nia DaCosta, who we know as the director of the Candyman reboot, and also The Marvels, but let's not give her all the credit for that because I don't think she'd want it. Luckily, that film is also fantastic. Feels different, moves differently, isn't quite as showy as the previous film. But again, just a great fun piece of post-apocalyptic media. In The Bone Temple, which is what I'm going to keep calling it because I'm not going to keep calling it 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. In The Bone Temple, the character of Spike is taken under the wing of the character of Jimmy, who is the leader of a group of guys that all dress exactly the same. I'll get into that in a second. And they are only allowed so many members. So for one member to join, another member has to die in a fight with that new member. That's the opening of the film. So it literally picks up, could be minutes after the end of the first film. The character of Spike kind of gets sidelined for a majority of this second film, which is a bit of a shame because he's absolutely fantastic in the original movie. He's not gone. He's there for pretty much the entire running time, but he's not really the protagonist. He's sort of protagonist adjacent. But hopefully his journey will pay off more in another installment. The real kind of lead characters in this, and there's a dual narrative going on. There's the character of Jimmy, who was 8 years old when the virus first kicked off, so would be somewhere in his kind of early 30s now. And he's the leader of a cult of people that just go around murdering people in England. That's it. They go around murdering people. If they're infected, they kill them. If they're human, they kill them. Maybe take some of their resources. Maybe take one into the gang. They're essentially Satanists, but they don't look or dress like what you would expect a Satanist to dress like. They look and dress like Jimmy Savile, which, I mean, to be fair, is about as close as you can get. The parallels there, is obviously when the virus kicked off back in 2002, the sort of 28 years of progress that we've had since then haven't really happened in the world of this film. So in the world of this film, Jimmy Savile was never outed as an abuser. He was just the guy on TV that we knew him to be back in the sort of early 2000s. So this character, without saying his name specifically, although the character is called Jimmy and says the catchphrase of Jimmy Savile and dresses like Jimmy Savile, obviously has been inspired to dress like one of his childhood heroes. And it's a very sort of gaudy, very tacky way of representing evil. And it's fantastic. And it's very British. And it fits into the world of this narrative extremely well. My only concern with it, and it's such a niggling thing, it's not even a concern, concern's the wrong word. My only niggling issue with it is if a kid was 8 years old in 2002, there's no way Jimmy Savile would be an idol. He probably wouldn't even know who Jimmy Savile was. If you were 8 years old in 2002, your idols were Pikachu, I don't know, Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's about it. Jimmy Savile, not so relevant. So I can see why they've used him, and I don't think they're wrong to use him, but it is a bit of a stretch for someone of that age to even know who he was, particularly if the world all fell apart in 2002. It's not like they can do research. The film before this opens back in 2002 with the Jimmy character as a kid watching Teletubbies with his sisters, I think, and then his family are all getting infected and going apeshit around him. That's not just a nostalgic opening scene, although it's a fantastic way of bringing us back into that original film's universe. But it actually pays off in this. The Teletubbies come up a whole bunch of times. And I actually think the Teletubbies are a far more relevant millennium-based inspiration than Jimmy Savile is. So you've got the plot of Jimmy and Spike and his cult that are going around just causing hyper-violence to people for no rhyme or reason. And then you've got a second plot, which picks up with the Doctor, played by Ralph Fiennes, and his interest in an alpha zombie that's kind of following him around, essentially. The Doctor, as identified in the previous movie, can kind of stun creatures or people with a mix of drugs that he would spit out of a dart gun, and it kind of puts the creatures in a trance where they just sort of stand there, kind of being high, essentially. It turns out that he's done this so many times to this alpha that this alpha is now turning up to get high. It's turning up to get the blow dart and to then feel the tranquility of that. And this interests the character of the Doctor because that's not just a beast that's hyper rage and hyper angry that's attacking everything. That's a person making a conscious decision as far as this Doctor is concerned, and that's an interesting thing. So the film kind of splits between these kind of intense scenes of tense anxiety and violent, torturous gore, uh, which I don't think there's any other way of naming it, and then some like genuinely funny, genuinely affecting, lovely scenes and tranquil moments of a Doctor and his brand new drugged out zombie friend. Which, if you were to watch the first 28 days later and then just completely skip all the other installments and get to this one, you probably wonder, like, how the hell have we gotten here? Like, the first movie, everything that looks at you is going to chase you down, vomit in your eyes, and eat you. And then in this film, whilst that's technically still the backbone of the story, there's scenes of Ralph Fiennes just dancing with an alpha, which is in there for a reason. It's not just in there for a laugh, it's in there to make a point, which builds on that first film's point of it doesn't matter if you're infected or not infected, you're the same thing. You're a person, you're a creature, and you've got so much time on Earth and then it's gone. What I didn't expect this new film to do is to go into metaphors about the health service. They're not even metaphors, actually. He openly talks about being part of the NHS and providing a free health service to this creature. He says it as a joke. But as the film goes on, the parallels between a cult leader that's going around violently hurting people and the mental difficulties that kind of character might have, and the infected creature that can't help but beat people to death and eat their faces, and the fact that that's an illness as well. And so the thing that kind of joins these two is this Doctor character that stands in as a metaphor for the recent health crisis in the world and in the UK, and the doctors that stood on the front line of that. Um, it's not even buried. It's quite straightforward. This is a film that wholeheartedly supports the National Health Service. This is a film that wholeheartedly supports doctors and the need for medical aid and medical attention, and how important that is that we have access to that. Doesn't matter if you're a rage spewing, super violent hyper zombie or just a dickhead. Like, ultimately, you might need someone to talk to, or you might need someone to give you medication, and that could help you live a more fulfilling life. It's a very interesting and purposeful message that I don't think anyone was expecting from a franchise that started with Cillian Murphy running away from things trying to eat its face. Admittedly, that first film does have, some messages in there about the problem with the masculinity in the army, and there's a character played by Christopher Eccleston who is the leader of a unit of commandos, and the second they suddenly see females for the first time in 28 days, they get a little bit rapey. I don't think there's any other way of putting that. And so that can't be avoided in terms of being a commentary on the military and on kind of those boys kind of groups. I don't know how well that holds up, because ultimately I wasn't that old when I first saw it, and I haven't really gone back and done research into what the world was doing in 2002 to inspire 28 Days Later. But I can tell you that this new one is a clear response to COVID, and a clear response to the national health crisis that we've had in recent years. On top of that, the film also has a kind of message there about following false idols, and following people that might be able to talk a big game, but underneath the surface are just arseholes. And you don't have to look far to see where the inspiration for that is. You don't have to look outside of this country. And if you do look outside of this country, you don't have to look pretty far to get where the inspiration for that was. Where all of this messaging might lose people is that we are quite far away now from the realistic depiction of zombies. Anybody that's coming into the new 28 Years Later film, or even the last 28 Years Later, and is expecting just a high octane movie full of chase sequences, you're not going to get that. And there's decisions that happen in this film that, if you sit and think about it for any longer than like 5 minutes, you're going to start to realize don't make much sense. If you think of the Doctor character building an entire bone temple, like, how do you get away with that in a world where there are infected running around you constantly? How do you spend 28 years, assuming you spent 28 years doing it, how do you spend 5 years doing it, building an entire temple of bones out in the open, and then setting off, huge fires in order to kind of burn the skin off of people's skeletons and stuff, and not instantly call attention to yourself from the thousands of creatures that are running around the countryside? In these two films alone, it's quite evident that there is a lot of infected just around the area where these characters live. I don't know how. I think that's one thing these films haven't answered yet, is how there are so many zombies left in England. By the end of the first film, they were starting to starve to death. By the beginning of the second film, they'd all starved to death. So how there can still be any creatures left in a isolated country 28 years after a virus has kicked in, I can't see it. 99% of them would have started. Even the ones that were chasing deer, which is what the implication is in this. The implication is they've evolved so that some of them are just crawling along the ground eating worms, and some of them have turned into massive alphas that are chasing deer and killing them, and then all the other zombies come and eat from the deer. I don't think there are that many deer around. Maybe in rural areas, but have you ever tried to chase a deer? I mean, I've never tried to chase a deer, but I can't imagine it's easy. So I don't understand how there's so many creatures still left around, but I'm willing to take that logical jump. Otherwise, the film wouldn't exist, and I want the film to exist. But yeah, there are characters doing things in this film that would absolutely bring a massive horde towards them. There is a scene which is extremely metal, and will become the talking point of the film, and it absolutely should be, because heavy metal is awesome. And there is no way, if you were playing heavy metal at the volume that it's being played at the scene in question, you'd have an entire country's worth of the dead on your doorstep. So you've got to follow the fairy tale nature of the story. You can't go into it expecting the hyper realism of the first film. In the first film, they daren't say a word at some points, and at the beginning of the second film, there's a character hiding in the cabin that daren't sneeze, daren't creak, because something might find them. Whereas, admittedly, okay, 30 years have gone by, so I know that these things become normal after a while. But even so, I wouldn't be building a bone temple if I could be eaten by anything in the countryside. The Bone Temple is a much more traditional looking film than 28 Years Later. It doesn't have editing techniques that call attention to itself as much as that first film does. Pretty sure it wasn't filmed on iPhones. I think it was filmed pretty traditionally. Um, so it's a lot less of a showy film than that first one. It's not calling attention to itself as much as that original film is. But that doesn't mean that it's not gorgeous. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have some scenes that are absolutely stunning, some shots that are absolutely fantastic, and sequences that are very well edited and run together very well. It is, in my mind, as good as the one that came before it, just in a slightly different way. Do I wish there was a few more infected in it? Maybe. Yeah. Not because I need it to be like the first film, but I do think you almost kind of forget that that's happening, which I think is going to maybe drive some audiences away from it a little bit, as it's not going to have as many sort of creatures running around it as that first couple of films do. Are there tropes in this film that we've seen elsewhere? Yeah, absolutely. The character of Jimmy and his kind of disciples, they're not worlds away from Negan, from the Walking Dead series, who again is a kind of a cult figurehead that's violently torturing people in order to show strength. He's not worlds away from that. He's not the same. Not he looks different, he acts different, he's got different motivations, but it's a post-apocalyptic zombie world with that kind of character in it. So we have sort of seen it before, but it's presented in such a kind of new and unique and charismatic way, with a very sort of English or British edge to it, and with something very specific to say, that it's absolutely worth a watch. And I would recommend it to sort of anybody, whether they were a zombie film fan or not a zombie film fan. That's neither here nor there. I'm excited to see where the third installment is going to go. I'm genuinely happy that they've chosen to do something completely different to the franchise with what we were all expecting when 28 weeks later finished. Um, and if Danny Boyle's coming back to do the last one, I'm sort of, I'm on board with it. I want to be there. Oh, shit.